My name is Michael Barron, and on behalf of BNY Wealth Management and the Foreign Policy Research Organization, it is my pleasure to welcome you back to the National Liberty Museum tonight. I'll take a different turn real quick. By show of hands, how many people are here at an FPRI event for Geopolitics with Granary for the very first time tonight? Welcome. For those of you who did not raise their hands, thank you for your support. It means a lot to this organization. We could not do what's happening here tonight without you. So thank you for being here personally. Thank you for investing in the organization. And I'm going to challenge you one more way. We need your support, not only in the ways I just mentioned, but we need you to be vested. What do I mean by vested? I would challenge each and every one of you that this room, although it seems physically impossible, should actually be filled 3 times more than this. There's never been a more important time to have the type of conversations that we've had, and we will have tonight than there is right now. This organization cannot possibly put on 70 events and continue to do the research, foreign policy research organization, without your help and support. So I invite you all at our next event to invite a friend. Reach out, somebody who should be here and join our dialogue. Thank you. It's my great honor to introduce my friend, our host of his very own program, the director of the Americas Study, the Study for Americas in the West, Ron Granary.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. It's Tuesday in Philadelphia, and the world is as complicated as ever, so let's talk about it. Welcome to the May 2017 edition of Geopolitics with Granary, FPRI's monthly discussion of international affairs. I'm Ron Granary, Executive Director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America in the West, your host and moderator of tonight's discussion. All of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us today, live and archived on the internet, and live this evening on May 2nd, 2017 at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia. It's a pleasure to have you with us. The contemporary Middle East continues to be the arena for multiple cross-cutting conflicts, which have ensnared not just the United States, but also Russians, Israelis, Turks, Iraqis, Saudis, Syrians, and others. Local power struggles are further complicated by tensions between Islamist and secular Muslims and the historical conflict between Sunni and Shia. Increasingly enmeshed in all of these conflicts is the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is pursuing a strategy guided by both great power pretensions and a sense of religious mission to preserve and extend the influence of Shiites and to assume for Iran a leadership role in the struggle against both the great Satan in Washington and the lesser Satan in Tel Aviv. Our guest this evening, Dr. Afshon Ostovar, has recently published a compelling historical and political analysis of one of the most important yet imperfectly understood forces in Iran's rise to regional influence, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. The Vanguard of the Imam, as the IRGC is known, has grown alongside the Islamic Republic in the nearly 4 decades since the revolution that overthrew the Shah. Transformed, quote, from a poorly funded, poorly organized militia into the most formidable entity in Iran next to the supreme leader, close quote. Every conflict in the region, from the Iran-Iraq War and the Israeli incursion into Lebanon, to the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, to the civil conflicts in Syria and Yemen, have provided new opportunities for the IRGC to expand its power. Once the poor stepchild of the security establishment, it now enjoys significant influence, acting as a conduit for Iranian influence in the greater Middle East and supporting clients from Hamas and Hezbollah to Yemeni Houthis and Syria's Bashar al-Assad. The IRGC's religious identity is an important part of this influence. As Dr. Ostovar put it, quote, Shiism is the ether through which Iran's influence is most effectively transmitted. And the IRGC is the most powerful Shiite transmission belt currently operating. But the IRGC is also a practitioner of realpolitik, as it seeks to advance Iranian interests in pragmatic alliances with Sunni forces such as Hamas, occasionally, and with outside powers such as Russia. International and domestic influence have gone hand in hand, as the IRGC, the instrument of Iran's supreme leader, has helped shape Iranian society, standing in the path of political reform in defense of its vision of the ideal society. Wherever one looks, in the economy, in politics, even in nuclear research, one finds the IRGC. One strains to think of an apt historical comparison for such a combination of religious, political, military, economic, and intelligence influence. We talked a little bit about comparisons, but I was thinking as I came in here, is the IRGC a Praetorian Guard? Is it the Shiite equivalent of the Jesuit Order or the Knights Templar? Is it a religiously transfigured KGB or Savak, to use the name of the Shah's Security Intelligence Service? Or is it something sui generis? And what will its role be in the future of Iran and Iranian-American relations? These questions and yours will guide us tonight in conversation with our guest, Dr. Afshon Ostovar. Dr. Afshon Ostovar is Assistant Professor of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School, holder of a BA summa cum laude in Near Eastern Studies from the University of Arizona, and a PhD in History from the University of Michigan. He has been a research scientist in the Center for Strategic Studies at CNA, a fellow at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and has taught at Johns Hopkins University. In addition to Vanguard of the Imam, Dr. Ostovar's publications include Sectarian Dilemmas in Iranian Foreign Policy, When Strategy and Identity Politics Collide, a report that looks at how Iran tries to balance its pan-Islamic aspirations with its more immediate strategic goals, and The Rebel Alliance, Why Syria's Armed Opposition Has Failed to Unify, a report that looks at how outside private funding has encouraged fracturing within Syria's rebellion and emboldened Salafi and jihadist groups. Dr. Ostovar is a contributor to War on the Rocks and Lawfare, and his commentary regularly appears in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Politico, Vox, The Guardian, and other popular media, such as the New York Times, BBC, Reuters, Bloomberg, and National Public Radio. A rising star in the study of one of the world's most fascinating and complex societies, we are delighted to have him with us tonight. Welcome, Dr. Afshon Ostovar.
Thank you very much.
So I want to start by asking a background question.
Sure.
How did the IRGC emerge in Iranian
So
society?
the IRGC emerged in the midst of the 1979 revolution itself. There were a lot of militants involved, and the IRGC was basically a way to collect all the militants that were more or less in line with and supportive of Ayatollah Khomeini, who was sort of the leader of the revolution. So it became a way both originally to centralize all of these various militants under one umbrella and under the leadership of Khomeini, and then ultimately to institutionalize those militants into a military that was at first supposed to be parallel to the regular military, which was the military that had begun before the revolution, that was part of the Shah's regime, and then ultimately become what their name means, which is the protectors of the revolution. And it's really that responsibility that they are to safeguard the revolution, which has really led to their growth in politics and in strategic affairs and in foreign policy, because in many ways, if you're going to protect the revolution on any front, that it's at risk. And it's at risk, according to them, just about in any arena. And so any arena where that risk exists, they become involved.
And what exactly is the relationship between the IRGC and Iran's religious hierarchy? Right? Are they a secular organization or a religious organization?
Yeah, no, they take their cues from the religious leadership in Iran insofar as it means correct religious belief, correct religious interpretation, religious practice, all the sort of the nitty-gritty about how to be a proper adherent. But when it comes to sort of the religious political interface, they follow the supreme leader. I mean, they really are the supreme leader's apparatus of control in many ways, and the supreme leader is what gives them the legitimacy. So the way that I sort of describe it, there's this old saying in Islamic studies, but also in others, that you have sort of the power of the pen and you have the power of the sword. The supreme leader is the power of the pen. The IRGC is the power of the sword, if you kind of want to understand the Islamic Republic's political dynamics that way.
Have different supreme leaders used the IRGC differently?
The original Ayatollah Khomeini was very close to the IRGC, but he had a very large constituency, both popular in Iran and within the early revolutionary leaders. And so he did not need to necessarily placate the IRGC to the extent that his replacement did, or successor, Ali Khamenei, now Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. When Ali Khamenei became the supreme leader in 1989 after Khomeini's death, he did not have a constituency like Ayatollah Khomeini did. He did not have, he was not as high ranking a clergy. He did not have his own following. He basically needed a support system, a constituency, and the IRGC needed a patron. And basically through politics, they found each other, and the IRGC became the foremost defender of the Supreme Leader, and the Supreme Leader over time embraced the IRGC and rewarded them for that loyalty.
And yet up to this point, right, one of the, when you are the defender of the Supreme Leader, right, there's always the danger that you'll decide to go into business for yourself.
Right.
To use the example of the
Right.
Praetorian Guard. And yet the IRGC has not so far played a role in selection
Right.
of supreme leaders or in any changing in the supreme
Right.
leadership. Is this a product of sort of self-denial on the part of the IRGC or some other larger arrangement?
To me, it's both institutional and in terms of their own self-conception of what their role is in the revolution, in the sort of Islamic system that Iran has established. Some have argued that the IRGC has already transcended the supreme leader in terms of power, and you hear that a lot, that the IRGC basically controls everything. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. Could it be so in the future? Who knows? But at this point, I feel that the IRGC benefits as much from being subservient to the supreme leader as the supreme leader benefits from that subservience, from that loyalty. To me, central to their identity is protecting the Islamic system in Iran, and central to the Islamic system in Iran is the role of the supreme leader. So I liken them to a more obscure, sort of ancient political artifact or artifice, which was the Comitatus. And the Comitatus is kind of like the Praetorian Guard, but the difference is that when the leader goes away, the Comitatus was just basically literally the guardian corps of the militants that surround the leader. When that leader goes away, his Comitatus goes away. He can't succeed and sort of go on to a next leader. In fact, in ancient times, like in Mongolia and other places, when the leader died, the Comitatus committed suicide, ritual en masse, and buried themselves with the leader. Now, I don't think the IRGC will do that when Khamenei dies, but what I mean by that is I feel that the leader is central to their identity, and so even not the personality, but the institution of the leader. So even if the next leader is weaker than a Khamenei or more powerful, regardless, I think the IRGC is going to at least want to keep the perception that they are subservient to the leader. And frankly, I don't see them wanting to govern. I don't see that as part of what they're trying to achieve in Iran.
And am I correct? There's no religious rank within the IRGC, right? These are not religious figures. There are no clergy in the leadership of
For the
IRGC.
most part, there is sort of a clerical wing, if you will, that's akin to chaplains.
Okay.
You know, something akin to chaplains. And then the IRGC has a volunteer militia that's below it. That's one of its divisions known as the Basij. And the Basij has a lot of clerical sort of members. But they don't necessarily fight on the front lines, carry weapons, that kind of thing. They have a clerical role. So they're involved in the intelligence ministry or the intelligence division of the IRGC. They're in charge of sort of the information operations, or what the IRGC calls sort of the cultural work of the IRGC. And that is basically sort of how keeping the IRGC politically orthodox, keeping its message on point, keeping it in line with the supreme leader. You have a clerical component, but basically the IRGC is a military institution with laymen, not clergy.
Does the IRGC police itself, and also when I'm thinking of if it's about preserving orthodoxy in a particular way, does it have its own sort of internal mechanisms for making sure that the leadership stays on message?
They do, and this happened a lot more during the 1980s when political contestation was a little more rife within sort of the regime itself. There was more infighting, and the IRGC was more factionalized at that time because, like I said, it started from a lot of different factions that came together, and so there were growing pains, you can say, during the 80s. But I would say now they probably do, but to a far lesser degree, or at least a degree that does not really bubble up much. You know, there may be forced retirements, there may be demotions that we don't see sort of, you know, from my vantage point at least. But it's not something that happens all that often. You do have IRGC people who sort of flee to a different country and sort of go into hiding and get quoted in newspapers here and there. And so maybe that is why they did it, to escape something. But I think for the most part, the IRGC is surprisingly, you may not think of it, but it is culturally a loose organization. There's a lot of sort of give and take between the soldiers and the officers. There's literally a hierarchy, but that hierarchy is a little more informal. I mean, I would liken it even, this may be controversial, but to the IDF. It's a little closer, I think, to the IDF in terms of its sort of fraternal emphasis, as opposed to its top-down decision-making. Whereas Iran's regular military, which is sort of the parallel institution to the IRGC, is much more rank and file. And so I did a research project which interviewed Iranians that just took part in all aspects of the military. If you don't know this, Iran is a conscript nation, so all of the lower ranks and all of its forces are conscripts.
Even in the IRGC?
Even in the IRGC. The exception is the Basij component, that's all volunteer. But within the conscripts, if your politics were more or less neutral, you preferred to be in the IRGC. That's what you hoped for.
Really?
Because it was a looser atmosphere. You know, as one person described it, you get up, you take your bus to the base, you say morning prayers, you have some chai, you have some tea and some cheese and bread, and you chit-chat with your members, you say your next prayer, maybe you do some sort of marching around or whatever it is, and then by 2 o'clock you go home. So not all that bad as a gig if you don't want to be in the military and you're going to be there for a year and a half, it sounded okay. Whereas the military was much more how we sort of see militaries, a little more screaming, a little more tough.
Uniforms? Different from the Army?
Slightly different, slightly different. Originally, they didn't have specific uniforms. They actually did. They were just khaki, sort of bland. They called them green, and it was meant to be the color of the prophet, but the greenness is more khaki in our parlance than green. And they adopted ranks after the Iran-Iraq War. Those ranks were actually imposed upon them by former President Rafsanjani as a way of sort of professionalizing the organization. But through the Iran-Iraq War, they had no ranks. So it really was meant to be an equalitarian, if not egalitarian kind of institution. You had commanders, but those commanders were people that were either veterans or had risen to the moment. And frankly, during the Iran-Iraq War, a lot of people died, so a lot of people had an opportunity to be a commander. Sure. But over time, they've become more professional. And so uniforms and all that stuff has been regularized.
You mentioned the comparison to the Comitatus, but is there an Islamic like going back to the days of the Prophet or to the days of the Imams?
Not so much there, but you actually do have the Comitatus that bleeds over into sort of as a Near Eastern institution into Muslim empires, and so it was slightly different. Like I said, there was no mass, no
mass suicide.
Yeah, no mass suicide, no ritual suicide. But there was this idea of the leader, and the leader being the king, who's essentially a warlord, being surrounded by a trusted retinue of warriors, and these warriors were they relied on the leader, and the leader gave them certain benefits to make them to have an elite status, and they sort of served the leader very loyally. And then if that leader died, then there would be competition with other leaders, and maybe they would lose out. But
So the current leader of the IRGC, what rank does he hold? Is he a general in comparison to the commander of the army?
He's a major general.
He's a major general.
Yeah, you don't have a 4-star general. 3 stars the highest you can go. 4 stars reserved for the Mahdi should he return, or when he returns.
When he returns. Interesting. I won't say a joke about a pre-modern major general.
Yeah.
But what is the relationship of the IRGC to Iran's security and foreign policy decision making?
It's a little unclear, and people debate about this. So I don't want to say that there's an academic consensus on this. I have my own views, and obviously I'm going to give you my views and not somebody else's. But
that's all right. That's why we brought you
right.
your book.
But in my opinion, they are very consequential and very influential, whether it's through formal channels, or whether it's through influence, or whether it's through leverage, or whether it's through inertia. All of that is a little opaque. But when it comes to foreign policy in the Middle East, to me they are basically the decision makers, if not the shapers of that policy. So when it comes to policies with Malaysia or Sudan or Venezuela or Canada or whatever, I think they have far less influence. But when it comes to what's going on in Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or whatever, to me it's either their activity or their literal sort of lobbying the supreme leader that seems to dictate policy more than anything else.
And is this because of their connection to particular organizations like Hezbollah or Hamas, or are those connections reflective of their influence?
I would say both. I would say both. But basically, they've done the groundwork. They control the ground game in all of those countries, and I think the supreme leader has bought off on that. I think the supreme leader agrees with that approach, and that approach has had a certain amount, if from their perspective, a certain amount of success, particularly since 2003. So the 21st century, loosely has been very, very successful for what the IRGC has been trying to achieve ever since their establishment. And I think the supreme leader appreciates this and so backs them. So you get that there are tensions between the elected government in Iran and the IRGC, particularly the current elected one or former reformist ones. There was more commonality between Ahmadinejad in his 8 years in office and the IRGC. But there really doesn't seem to be, the Rouhani government, should it disagree strongly with what the IRGC is doing in any of these countries, it does not seem to matter, because in terms of behavior, the IRGC is doing just about what I would expect, whatever they want. Now, behind the scenes, behind the closed curtain, there's probably give and take. And the IRGC probably is not getting everything that it wants, and the government probably does have a stronger position than that. But I think overall, I think the IRGC shapes Middle East policy more to its liking than any other institution in Iran.
And it's a chicken and egg question, right? Is it because the IRGC is so in tune with the consensus in Iran that they seem to be getting what they want, or are they shaping that consensus?
I think in some ways both. I mean, it depends. Like, leadership in Iran is kind of like a Matryoshka doll, right? Like it began with the big doll, and every few years you're kind of peeling off, layers, and whoever was in is now out, and whatever. And so you're left with a pretty small circle, and I'm including the reformists in that circle of potential sort of leaders, part of that are have any voice within the regime. So I think there's broad commonality with things. Like the reformists, let's take Hezbollah for instance. It's people who are now reformists were the ones that sort of championed a lot of Iran's foreign activities in the 1980s. They were the radicals. They were the ones that were the most internationalist looking, less inclusive, more sort of outward looking. And so I think they see Hezbollah as part of their legacy as well. But I also think that the reformists see the downside of putting so much emphasis on supporting non-state actors outside of Iran's borders. But the IRGC, on the other hand, and I think the Supreme Leader agrees with this, sees a lot of success. I mean, what they see is that they defeated the United States in Iraq after Saddam Hussein. They were able to sort of outmaneuver the United States, harass U.S. forces, scuttle the SOFA, the Status of Forces Agreement in 2011, and ultimately force the United States to abandon what it wanted to do, what its plans were in Iraq. Now, of course, there are domestic politics, political reasons in the United States that complicates that whole narrative. But from their perspective, I think that's how they see it. And if you can drive out the United States, then what's to say you can't do that other places? So to me, that experience in Iraq was transformational for the IRGC. And you see that in Syria too. They've been able to sort of help the Assad regime survive. They've been able to sort of stave off advancements from their other adversaries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, the United States, Europe. They've enlisted Russia to help them with this. But they're having success, I think, from their perspective.
I'm glad you brought up the enlisting Russia. As soon as you mentioned the Matryoshka dolls, I thought of this. Right? That if Iran's largest foreign policy goal is to drive out foreign influences from the region, at the same time, however, they have invited this old imperial power into the region. Is that what sense you get of how the IRGC imagines this cooperation with Russia to save Bashar al-Assad? What's supposed to happen after he's been saved?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, one, it speaks to the IRGC's pragmatism. I think they are a pragmatic organization, and while they are ideological, while they are religious, I think our view of them being ideological or religiously driven is somewhat of a misnomer, and it betrays their actual pragmatism. I mean, for the most part, they're in it to win it. And if they can sort of make friends with others that sort of have, maybe their interests coincide a little bit, but not on everything, they may take that chance. So in this case, it's sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. But I also think it was an admittance that they were going to lose in Syria, ultimately. They needed a game changer. I mean, the IRGC is good at guerrilla fighting. They've learned a lot from Hezbollah. Hezbollah has achieved quite a lot militarily over its decades of operation. And so they could compete with ISIS and the other rebel groups. But it was more peer-to-peer competition. And they needed a game changer. And basically that was air power. They had no air power. And that's what I keep wanting to say the Soviet Union. That's what.
So does Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, exactly. Freudian slip all around, right? But Russia brings that, and I think there's this idea also, maybe even from the IRGC standpoint, that, hey, we ultimately can't go it alone. We do need some friends. And if we're going to make friends, Venezuela is a fine friend to have, right? But building bicycle factories in Venezuela is only going to help us so much. If we can befriend Russia, that's a real curb to American influence. And I think, frankly, it worked. I mean, I think, not speaking for the past administration, but I know just from being in the DC orbit and having conversations in this area that Russia, even more than Iran, was always that question about what we should do about Syria. If we do go in, and I'm talking 2012, if we do go in, how does Russia perceive that? Does this escalate things with Russia? Do we really want that escalation with Russia? And, after Russia's been on board, Iran gets invited to all the meetings. It's part of the club. It's part of the decision-making apparatus. It normalized Iran's effort in Syria. It went from being covert to more or less overt. And so I think they're gaining benefits from it. But certainly there's a very, very rich irony that's not lost on any Iran watchers or scholars, that Iran's sort of revolutionary slogan was neither East nor West, and this meant neither the United States nor the Soviet Union. And basically there's now just neither West, and East is okay.
So do you think that, to push on the Syria question just a little bit, are the Iranians interested in saving Bashar al-Assad and a unitary Syria, or are they interested primarily in just maintaining their influence in whatever Syria's emerge?
I would say yes and yes.
Okay.
Right. So I think it's sort of degrees of what they're able to achieve. Certainly the latter is the most important. If they can have basically the border areas of the Mediterranean, Lebanon and Israel and Damascus, and if they can have Aleppo, then that's a clear win. They don't need the sort of tribal southeast. and the Kurds can have sort of the northeast. I think Iran would be okay with that, but Iran, just like a lot of countries, European countries, China, Russia, are anathema to the idea of officially partitioning a country along ethno-minority lines, right?
Because they would face the same problem.
They
at
would
home?
face the same thing, right? So Spain, France, China, Russia, they're all in this together in that sense. They don't want to set a precedent. This is why Kosovo was a problem and to a lot of countries. So Iran doesn't like the idea of giving the Kurds, a homeland, doesn't like the idea of making a Sunnistan kind of thing. And they like integrity. I mean, nobody, that's the other thing that I think all of these countries agree on, is that some disgruntled citizens shouldn't be allowed to start a war and then somehow break up a country, right? That's kind of their perspective. So
even if the disgruntled citizens in Syria are actually the majority, right? All right. Yeah. Disgruntlement is not okay.
The state is what's legitimate.
The state is what's legitimate.
Yeah.
There we go. Fair enough. One more question before we open up to the audience, and that is, we think about the role that Iran generally, and the IRGC in particular, is playing in the larger neighborhood. And you refer in your book to the Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And what role does the IRGC play in that Cold War?
I think they're at the head of it. I mean, frankly, to me, when it comes to strategic decision making in the Middle East, the IRGC is first among equals, if not, sort of the top decision maker. And their competition or rivalry with Saudi Arabia is first and foremost. And Cold War to me is not even really a particularly apt way to do it, but warm war is not.
It's certainly not cold.
Warm war is not really a term of art that people accept, and hot war is war. So because they're not literally at war with Saudi Arabia, I call it a Cold War. But I would put Israel in the same category, in the sense that the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran is very similar to the competition between, or the rivalry or conflict between Israel and Iran, insofar as it's generally taking place and affecting places around those countries, right? So for Saudi Arabia, there's Iraq, there's Yemen. For Israel, there's Lebanon, there's Syria, there's obviously the Palestinian territories. It gets complicated. But to me, the IRGC is at the head of it, and that to me is where it becomes difficult, because ultimately, I talk in a paper that I haven't published yet, but they risk sort of biting off more than they can chew, right? Let's just say they succeed in all of these conflicts and their clients succeed. What do, right? They've inherited a failed state in Syria, they've inherited a failing state in Iraq, and they've inherited a failed state in Yemen. So what does that give you, ultimately?
Especially if it drives the Saudis and the Israelis into each other's arms.
Right, exactly. So you can think about sort of their own sort of strategic goals of undermining or destroying Israel, however you want to look at it. Well, over the last 30 years, they've helped push most of the GC states into the orbit of Israel. I mean, obviously, diplomatic relations are not there, but military cooperation is there. I mean, having traveled a lot to the Gulf countries, Israel is never spoken about in ill terms, whereas Iran is enemy number one, without question. And so, it's pushed those groupings together. It's pushed the Emirates and Qatar and Saudi Arabia to develop their militaries at a very fast rate, all with the idea of countering Iran militarily. The Emirates have gone very far. I mean, in many ways, the war in Yemen is kind of as sad as it is because of all the humanitarian sort of devastation that's going on in Yemen. It's a practicing ground, right? This is the first war that Saudi Arabia and UAE have really become involved at all levels, from ground level to air power. And they're not going to war with Yemen or with parts of Yemen just to defeat those enemies. It's also a part of their own capabilities, with the idea that they're going to need to counter Iran military at some point.
It's interesting. You can fail upward, and you can also succeed downward if your success creates.
Yeah, and it's I think part of it is a myopia on everybody's part. But the idea that you're fighting this war against the United States, and that's how they see it, right? Israel is part of it, but you're fighting a war against the United States. And all of U.S. allies are seen part of the United States. So if you can undermine Saudi Arabia or UAE or Israel in any of the places that they want to be influential in, then you're succeeding, right? But the after effects of that, I think they haven't begun to be felt yet.
Interesting. All right, well, we will now turn to the audience, and according to our typical rule here at Geopolitics with Granary, a rule that's on its second episode, right? The first question goes to someone who has never been to Geopolitics with Granary before. So any first-time visitors, raise your hand. You get to ask the first question right up here in front. The microphone will come to you, and then you can speak into the microphone. Here he comes. We'll hand that up to the front right there. Thank you. Great.
Hi, first-time visitor.
Welcome.
What you describe is something like a combination of an army and a State Department. And what's puzzling is you also say these are conscripts, although very ideological conscripts, who come and have their tea and their cheese and go home at 2. I'm trying to reconcile the kind of intense ideological training and commitment with this notion of where are they conscripted from and how long do they stay. It's too casual and yet too intense, and I'm having a problem organizing that.
That's a perfect question. It gives me a good chance to clarify. So the conscript forces are left out of all of the things that I'm talking about. So all of the things I'm talking about is happening at a very high level. These are the flag officers, the top commanders that are deciding these things. And for the most part, the people that go to other countries as advisors, as Iran says, whether it's Iraq, Syria, other places, for the most part, the majority of them are also officers, mid-tier on up. And they really do, I think, to Iran's sort of credit, they really are serving more so as advisors than as war fighters. The conscripts generally are not involved in any of the stuff that's happening outside of the country. And the conscripts tend to serve no more than 2 years, sometimes 2.5, depending on the employment, and they wash out. So they're just a constant churn. But they really matter not for the politics of the organization, the decisions of the organization, or whatever. They just happen to be sort of the busybodies that man the bases, that do sort of the basic training. And should Iran ever be attacked by an outside country, they're the ones that will be on the front lines doing the fighting. But that's really all the conscripts are involved in. The people who are officers, they generally don't come from the conscript rank. They are generally they come out of military schools, or they come out of this popular militia that I talked about, the Basij, which, unlike the conscripts, is volunteer instead of involuntary. And not just volunteer, but you have to be vetted in order to join. And the vetting happens sometimes quite loosely, but basically it happens along the lines of, do you come from a religious family? Are you known to be religious yourself, active in mosque? Are you known to sort of have the right friends, not the wrong friends? Which is to say, sort of other religious youth instead of gang members or drug users or liberals or reformists or artists or whatever would be problematic. And can people vouch for you? And if you meet all that criteria, you come to basically what's the equivalent of Boy Scout meetings at a mosque, right? It's kind of a youth organization, very heavily youth organization. And if you matriculate and you stay part of it long enough, you can just sort of, leave at a certain point. You get busy, you get a job, you get married. People tend to age out of the Basij, and so there's sort of a youth movement. But if you stay in, there is sort of a military track in the Basij. And if you join that military track, when you're conscripted to do your military service, you can choose to be in the IRGC. You can get your choice, and you tend to be sort of part of the community that they're going to start promoting from. So the people that get promoted into the officers, into the senior officers, come from a very different strand of service than the conscripts. The conscripts are basically just a swath of everyday Iranians. Some of them may be in line with the IRGC, some of them may hate the IRGC and hate ever having to have been a part of it. But it's their service, they have no choice, so they take a part of it. Does that answer your question?
Good. Question right here up front.
For lack of a better word, I'm interested in technology. 3 specific areas: missiles, nuclear, Navy. What role does the Republican Guard play in these areas?
So their ballistic missile program, which is under the IRGC, is probably outside of what it's doing in other countries, Hezbollah, the Iraqi militias, whatever. The ballistic missile program, above all else, is their main investment for a deterrent, a strategic deterrent against their neighbors in particular, right? And so the idea is if they can have missiles that can strike Israel, if they have missiles that can strike Riyadh, or any other place that's sort of within the realm of possibility, they're going to build up an arsenal to do that. And so the idea is if Iran's attacked, they launch waves of missiles, and that's sort of the retaliation. So it's a capability that they hope never to use, because if they use it, it means that they're at war. But that is an IRGC program, so that they are fully invested in that. The nuclear issue is a little bit different, because the nuclear issue is technically a civilian program, because it's equivalent of an energy program or a medical program, but it's technically out of their portfolio. But any of the areas when it had come to perceived weaponization attempts, and I say that because it's a debated topic whether they tried to weaponize or not, or even whether they wanted one or not. But I tend to think that they did want one, and that they did try to weaponize. And I think that's where the evidence sort of suggests. That stuff was happening under the IRGC's auspices, right? So implosion devices, warheads, that kind of thing, that's all under the IRGC's responsibility. Naval is a little bit different, because there are parallel navies. You have the regular military, also known as the Artesh, and they have what we call sort of in Navy speak the blue water Navy. They have the bigger vessels, they have the destroyers, they have the larger sort of older ships, they have the larger subs. In fact, they have most of the subs that Iran has. And that, for the most part, is a prestige item for them. I don't know if, understanding Middle East navies is a rarefied field, but suffice it to say that Iran's neighbors have de-emphasized naval buildup. So their navies are quite less formidable and quite less sophisticated than Iran's are, right? Iran does port visits to countries far away like Sri Lanka. It's gone up all the way to the Mediterranean off of the Syrian coast. These are things that their neighbors cannot do. And so that's a prestige for them. But it really gives them very little utility in terms of military capabilities, because all of those ships could be sunk in a matter of minutes if they went to war with the United States or something like that. So it's something that gives them prestige, but not a lot of military power. The IRGC does not have those big platforms, but what it does have invested in is small boats, which are essentially speedboats that they outfit with sort of small rockets, large caliber machine guns. They can use them for mining. They can use them as suicide vessels, packed with explosives and ramming things. And those they use to quite great effect, at least in terms of how they use them in the Persian Gulf, which right now is basically to harass U.S. maritime vessels, U.S. naval vessels. They'll, basically they do the equivalent of coming up, just under a kilometer, doing some figure eights, kind of redneck sort of activity, or a good old boy. I mean, however you want to say, I don't want to be disparaging, but sort of that kind of, pickup truck kind of stuff.
So
they do that, but they'll do that with their weapons drawn, and so it's quite dangerous. All of those incidences have sort of passed by and never led to anything, but we know that they're there. They know that we know that, and they also know that they can be unpredictable, right? They have the coastline is spotted with sort of ways that they can hide these ships. They can bring these ships out at a moment's notice, and they can rush 40, 50 ships at a destroyer or a carrier strike group, and frankly, those things are hard to combat, right? It's hard to fight against, because if you've got 50 targets, you're going to have to pick and choose, and it takes a while. So it is a very sort of, I don't want to say crude, but a low technological kind of solution that they've come up with, but one that could have, at least in the short term, a significant effect. Long term, if there was a war between the United States and Iran, the small ships wouldn't matter all that much, but short term they could.
Mm-hmm. So they're the Dukes of Tehran.
Dukes of Tehran.
Question. Let's go right over here, please. Gentleman in the black hat. There's a microphone right there.
Along similar lines, can you talk a little bit about, let's call it the division of labor between the regular Iranian military and the IRGC? Like, are there pushes and pulls between the two organizations about who's deciding what and policy-wise?
Yes, that's a great question. When it gets to politics, the IRGC is technically not involved in politics. That's military. Yeah. But I'm just sort of making a point. The IRGC is technically not involved in politics, but they're politically very powerful. The regular military isn't involved in politics at all. They stay out of it. So the IRGC is kind of unique in that perspective. The IRGC is also unique in, for the most part, in some of the capabilities that it has, like the ballistic missile program. But other than that, they have parallel sort of services: land forces, air forces, and naval forces. The Air Force, the regular Air Force, has the more sophisticated planes, and the regular Navy has the more sophisticated Navy. In terms of division of labor, they literally have divided AORs, or areas of responsibility, between the two. So the Persian Gulf up into the Strait of Hormuz to Kuwait is IRGC controlled. Outside of the Strait of Hormuz into the Gulf of Oman, that's the regular Navy. The Caspian Sea is the regular Navy. But for the most part, the regular Navy is tasked with defending Iran's territorial integrity, right? They're a defensive force in that sense. The IRGC also has to do that, but that's the regular Navy's, or the regular military sort of bread and butter. So they're actually quite separate, but they have joint exercises and all that kind of stuff. They integrate at a certain level. When it comes to tug and pull kind of stuff, or disputes that are sort of political or financial or whatever, that does happen. But I think what often gets carried forward as a narrative is that there's this real distinction between the regular military and the IRGC. The regular military is non-ideological, non-political, more or less, is liked by the everyday citizen in Iran, whereas the IRGC is sort of the opposite of all that. There was some truth to a very real competition between the regular military and the IRGC during the Iran-Iraq War, during that conflict, because the IRGC started that war as basically a militia with no training, and the military was highly trained and knew what to do. But there was disagreements. Ultimately, the IRGC won, and that was basically through their political connections. But today, there are disputes between the two, but those disputes, I think, are much closer to the disputes between the Navy and the Army in the United States, or the Navy and the Air Force in the United States, than they are anything else. It's disagreements about funding, it's disagreements about who gets to have this program, who gets to have that program. If you're going to put money into a certain weapons thing, we would appreciate this, whereas they want that. It's that kind of stuff. It's far less political, because ultimately what happens is the top leadership of the regular military is drawn from the same pool of people as the IRGC. They're vetted along political, ideological, and sort of loyalty to the supreme leader. So there's not really a disconnect between the two agencies. However, the regular military sees themselves as more professional and, just speaking sort of anecdotally, is seen as more professional by outside navies, outside militaries as well.
Let's see, one question right here, Tom.
There's, with respect to our nuclear agreement with Iran, I understand here that there's this notion that all we did was defer the point in time when Iran would become a nuclear power. What is the point of view in the, in the Gulf region with the Saudis and others? Do they view that agreement the same way? Do they think that Iran's becoming a nuclear power is inevitable, and what will be, if that is the view, what are the implications, the consequences?
Right. I would say yes. I mean, to some degree, the people who didn't support the deal in the United States agree a lot. There's a lot of overlap with those who didn't agree with it in the Gulf countries in particular, right? They had the same problems with it. But I think the biggest problem is less the nuclear issue, because I feel that they feel confident that, okay, it is put on hold, but it's put on hold for a good amount of time, enough time where they can pivot militarily in terms of capabilities, investments, whatever. And if they want their own nuclear programs, like the UAE is developing civilian nuclear programs, they can do that and have them up and running by that point, and more or less be on par with Iran. So should Iran go nuclear, other states could go nuclear as well. But I think what they are far more bothered by is that what the nuclear agreement did was it just addressed the nuclear issue. And I think for parts of political constituencies in the United States as well as in the Middle East, the nuclear issue was a problem, but what made it more problematic than anything else was Iran's activities outside of its borders, right? Its support for groups like Hamas or Hezbollah or the Shia militias, or interfering in other countries as they see it. And when you solved that problem and took sanctions off because of that, it basically allowed Iran to have its cake and eat it too, right? Or in this case, not eat the frosting of the cake, but have the rest of the cake, right? The nuclear program was on hold, but they were able to keep all of their outside investments. That wasn't touched. And more than it wasn't touched, all the leverage that had been built up to sort of twist their arm was no longer there. So how are you going to go back and say, okay, we've solved that. Now we want to talk about what you're doing in Lebanon and Syria and Yemen and whatever. And that becomes a much more difficult task.
I have to ask to follow up on
Yeah.
that, right? That the thinking in Washington justifying the JCPOA was, we'll focus only on nuclear because here we can make a deal, and making any kind of deal will open the door to other negotiations.
Right.
Was this a naive expectation in Washington, or are we supposed to be more patient?
I think I think the fairest way to say it is that, as I understood the Obama administration's, what they saw that they were getting out of the deal, and this is from talking with people in the Obama administration about it, is that this was a non-proliferation issue for them. This was keeping nukes out of the hands of a country that we didn't trust with nukes.
Right.
And not only that, but keeping sort of the proliferation of nuclear weapons outside of the Middle East, right? It was non-proliferation, full stop. Everything else was different. If you want to deal with those issues, that was a different task. But here was an issue that they took seriously as a non-proliferation issue and felt that they could solve or at least address for a long period of time through this deal. And so along those lines, I don't think it was naive. I think it achieved what they had hoped to achieve. From people who were less sold on the deal, I think they were less sold on it because of everything else that the nuclear program, one of the problems of the nuclear program, people were afraid, okay, they could give a nuke to Hamas, or they could give a nuke to Hezbollah, or they could use a nuke themselves. I remember Well, anyway, I won't share that anecdote. But
Oh,
it was a family member, and I don't want to
Oh.
bring him into it. But suffice to say, lots of people thought that Iran would use a nuclear
Right.
weapon, and I think that was unlikely because that's your trump card, right? And if you use it, you've got nothing else, you know.
it's usually better not to use Trumps. Right?
Exactly, and in this case, So I was always less worried personally about Iran using a nuclear weapon themselves. To me, I thought they wanted it as a deterrent. But the question was whether, okay, would the deterrent make them feel safe and therefore less likely to sort of expand or follow what they're doing outside of their country, because that also has a deterrent effect, or would it in fact shield what they're doing and allow them to do that sort of even more openly and boldly? And I think what people are worried about now is that it's done the latter, right? That they don't need the nuclear deterrent anymore because now they have the nuclear deal deterrent, which in effect sort of took, again, the leverage out of the United States and the international community to put pressure on Iran, but Iran was able to keep this other deterrent, which, in my opinion, is actually much more important than a nuclear weapon would have been.
One last question from the audience, right here.
Obviously, very knowledgeable talk. I'm curious about what informs your judgment without getting thrown in jail. So, are you Iranian American? Do you speak Farsi? Do you regularly travel to Iran? Are you able to interrogate leadership of FPRI? I don't know.
Right. Right.
The Revolutionary Guard. And how are you able to do that without getting thrown in jail? And oh, by the way, what's the reaction that you sense within Iran to the change of administration in the United States?
Right. Okay. So two big questions.
That's right.
Yeah. So in terms of sources, so I'm a historian. I do come from a Persian family. Grew up, with Persian in the household, so can read Persian and use Persian sources. No, I cannot go to Iran. And having worked in sort of the DoD atmosphere, like I would, as I say, I would only go to Iran on Air Force One or some one or two steps below that in order to feel comfortable, which is sad because I have always, that's one of the reasons why you study a country is because you like the country and or at least are interested enough to go there. So no, can't go to Iran. And if you did go to Iran, you're not going to write a book like this. You could, just imagine, right, somebody coming to the United States and saying, I want to interview the CIA and ask about what you guys are doing in other countries and black sites and this kind of stuff. Like, you're just not going to get anywhere, right? And same would be Iran. Maybe you get some people to talk to you, but frankly, those interviews could be indicative of something else, but not of what they're actually doing. So in terms of sources, I think a lot of it you draw from statements, Iranian press, what's coming out of Iranian media. A lot of it comes out of Western reporting in places like Syria or Iraq. But frankly, what I focus on more than anything is behavior. I'm much more interested in what they do than what they say. What they say is important, but what they do to me speaks, much more clearly about their intentions. So I try to sort of step back a little bit and focus on the trajectories and trends and changes in behavior over time, and then look at the context surrounding that to try to glean, what those changes are. But that's generally my approach. So were I to go to Iran, I suppose I could be in jail. I tell you that they try to hack my email account. I'm on some list where I don't know if they like me or not, or just curious what's in my email. So
you don't click on many attachments.
No, I don't. So please don't send me any. So that puts me, I guess, in a group of thousands of others that the Islamic Republic wouldn't mind knowing a little bit more about. But I haven't got a lot of pushback about it. And then, I'm sorry, sir. What was the second question?
Their view of the United States.
The view of the United States. So frankly, it hasn't changed all that much. But what you got when Trump was being a little more vocal during before the election, during the campaign, you had some statements come from the Supreme Leader and from others that said, this frankly doesn't bother us. This sounds like the America that we know. This is the America that we had always sort of claimed to believe in. So this sounds right. You know, I think in an ironic way, they trust Trump, at least initially, much more than they ever trusted Obama. I think Obama was confusing to them because he really was reaching out. And I feel that the Islamic Republic did itself probably one of the greatest disservices by not accepting more of that reach out from the Obama administration and trying to take that opportunity to soften tensions between the U.S. And Iran than not. I mean, really, they didn't. And as soon as the JCPOA was done, at least the Revolutionary Guards have done several provocative acts. So I think, you know, they continue to do those provocative acts. I think that's obviously they're testing Trump to see, you know, if he means what he says and what that means for them. But I think for them, they dislike America just as much, not anymore. That is to say, the government of America just as much, not anymore. I don't think Trump is a game changer to them. But I feel like that there's less mystery about Trump than Obama. He speaks clearly and they understand it clearly.
Fair enough, which is an interestingly optimistic point on which to end this conversation. I'm sorry to say that our hour is up. That's all the time we have for now. Thank you, Afshon Ostovar, for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Couple of announcements. One is there are copies of Vanguard of the Imam available for purchase if you are interested in reading for yourself. FPR would like to thank the National Liberty Museum for hosting us, as well as BNY Mellon Wealth Management and the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation for their generous support for the program. Today's conversation, as ever, is just the beginning. The world goes on, and every month we will discuss it in Geopolitics with Granary, although we are entering our summer hiatus. Our next formal program for Geopolitics with Granary will be in September. But this program, in a small way, marked a milestone. This was the 50th conversation in Geopolitics with Granary, and we thank all of you for being part of the program. To keep up with future episodes of Geopolitics with Granary and other events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter, @RonaldGranary. And we look forward to seeing you and your friends that you bring to future events. Until those future events, for FPRI, for Eli Gilman, Peyton Windell, Rachel Hemler, and all the staff, I'm Ron Granary. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was great. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Jim Baker.
Jim.
This was interesting that Ron started talking about religious conflict.
Right.
He mentioned Syria state.
Right.
No religious conflict in the whole conversation. And the pragmatic